Well, welcome to this panel conversation, and I am delighted to welcome Emma Husar and Amani Haydar, who I've had the privilege of getting to know for a little while, and both are joining us to talk about moral injury from a lived experience or an observation point of view. So welcome to you both. Perhaps we can start with you, Emma. I mean, moral injury has been, I guess, at the centre of some of what you've actually been through. How's it impacted your life?
I think there's been several interfaces. I don't think there's a part of my life that it hasn't actually impacted. So I'll start, I suppose, physically with the physical symptoms. There was a heart condition that I developed. I had a mitral valve leak, which has been fairly well recovered and well treated now, which came as a result of the trauma initially. There was the hair loss. So all of my hair practically was just falling out in the shower. There was a drastic, I think I lost about 12 kilos in, the space of 2 or 3 weeks. So much so to the point that it actually stopped my period from coming. So, quite often we talk about young girls who have eating disorders, and that weight loss, will stop the menstruation and the cycles from happening, and that certainly happened. Then there's the sort of pervasive physical symptoms, I guess, which you don't necessarily can't quantify, but complete lack of sleep. I became completely insomniac. I didn't sleep for days and days and days at a time. Which then impacts your mental health and your resilience and your ability to cope with things. Then there was, I guess, the other things that you don't see, like the night terrors. I have even still, I have a dream that's essentially on repeat every few months now. It'll come, and that's about just not feeling physically safe. So I suppose they're the top line issues. And then there's the shame that you feel around, and that's not an injury that people can quantify or see or measure. But of course, when it was first put to me, when I was sitting in that room with John Whelan, who's the Labor Party barrister that was set to investigate all of this, when he first said to me, "Oh, you're accused of flashing without any underwear," immediately, I think the colour drained from my face, and that gut and that pit in your stomach just started to. And then I remember walking out and thinking to myself, who do I tell this to? Like, who do I tell this absolute crackpot of an accusation to? Who on earth? And the fact that the person that I was supposed to have done it to said it didn't happen, and then it's just basically my word against theirs. Yeah. And of course, it was never true. He was never even in there at the building the time that he reckoned that it happened. And I mean, when we went to court and I sued for defamation, I had to keep the dress that I was wearing from that day. I had to take the measurements of the chair that I was sitting in from that day,
Emma.
And make sure that actually what he was alleging was actually not only it didn't happen, but physically, in the outfit I was wearing and the chair that I was sitting in, it just couldn't have happened the way he described it. And then there was all the practical issues of what woman with 3 kids runs around any situation without underwear on. I mean, hello. There's pelvic floor issues, and my dear friend Yana, who I did SAS with, did a very good, I suppose, articulation of how women actually cope with having babies pressing against our bodies for 9 months at a time, times 3. So there was that physical aspect as well that was part of that shame. I had to go back to my pelvic floor physiotherapist that lots of women see after they've had babies, and get her to write a letter that said she couldn't have not been wearing underwear. So it was just the most, that part of it was particularly bad. But then there came the other part where they had accused me of, they didn't actually say that I was a slut, but the innuendo, the inference, and all of those things, that I was this brazen hussy doing the walls and the rounds and the floors of Parliament House. And that, of course, only happens to women in politics. And it certainly doesn't happen to the Jenny Macklins of politics, or the, you know, the people who are more senior and got their feet on the ground. It happens to young, fierce women who go in there with some identity, with a little bit of personality, and, you know, who are young and don't fit that white, middle-aged, overweight male wearing a suit and tie. You know, you saw it with Sarah Hanson-Young. Certainly Kate Ellis talked about it. Nicole Flint, who's the member for Boothby in South Australia, has talked about it. And certainly I think the country heard about it from my perspective. And if you put all of us girls together who were part of that, you would find that we were all, I think, largely under 40. I think Nicole was slightly older than me. Young, fit, vibrant, happy, and dare I say, not ugly to look at. You know, and that was I was subjected to all of those rumours and innuendo for the entire tenure of my stay there, which I kept raising to people like Tanya Plibersek, like Tony Burke, like Bill Shorten's office, because I was so confronted by the fact that people would talk about me in this way, which was utter bullshit. You know, there's never been a time in my life where anyone could say that my behaviour or conduct in a sexual nature could even fit that dialogue. And we'll just park that for a second. But even if that was true, even if I was inclined to do that, it's nobody's business anyway. And this idea that women's sexuality and sex lives is up for grabs as office gossip, or as a way of saying, oh, she only got there because she slept her way to the top. And that comes from both the blokes and the women. We've really got an issue. And of course, there was no evidence to sustain any of these accusations or allegations once we got into a defamation hearing. But the defamation hearing didn't get publicised. The contents of that, once the apology was issued, was probably about this big in the paper. But I'd spent nearly 8 weeks on the front page of every state newspaper across the nation. It went international. I'm sitting here in front of my bookcase. I'm looking at my bookcase, and I've got a massive lever arch file, 2 of them, that contain all the articles that were published about me. And I think in the end, not including what went to air on nightly news, morning breakfast, radio, there were 2,500 printed articles written about what had happened to me. I think morally, the other standpoint that we come to is the bystanders, who probably are just as bad as those who perpetrate, because you've got the bystanders who, by virtue of their silence, they tacitly approve what's gone on. And that creates this culture and this web of silence and staying silent and staying down and not using your voice for good. And I think I'll finish on the other impact of all of this is, as Brittany Higgins has said, I was treated as a political problem, where she talks about her physical assault. Mine was a sexual harassment. And I suppose in some ways, you know, that injury is a moral, is a moral issue. But I was treated as a political problem. So I was told to shut up. I was told to not do anything. And in fact, a few weeks, I think it was 1 week after the Sharon Stone allegation was published, it had been going for 3 weeks at that stage, like in terms of in the media, I decided to go on and be interviewed by Lee Sales on television and start to, the horrendous work of trying to claw back my integrity and my name. And the moment that I had a voice in all of this, the moment that I started to push back against this just tsunami of bullshit and articles and accusations and innuendo, the moment I started to push back and take my power back, 1, I felt better, and 2, the tide turned publicly. The court of public opinion stopped sending me the most horrendous abusive emails and inbox messages and DMs on every platform that I had. The media stopped and slowed down and went, oh, hang on a minute. yeah, it sounded like it was too good to be true, like this woman who's flashing herself and sleeping with everybody. And actually, where are all these people that are meant to have been, you know, where are they in any of this? None of them were ever named. None of them were ever, you know, put on the front page. Even though the only one that was ever named in the document, which was Jeremy Anderson, he's had 2 AVOs against him since that time for continuing to stalk and harass me, even 5 years later.
You?
Yeah,
You?
me. Yeah. So I had to take them out. And once when I moved to Perth in 2020, in the middle of 2020, when I moved here, and then again at the beginning of this year when he started again. And the sheer silence from the Labor Party in all of this is just gobsmacking. And then you've got the issue of people in the public thinking, oh, the Labor Party's great. They've got all these women and all this colour and movement. And, you know, we expect this behaviour from the Liberal Party, and we've dressed the Labor Party up in our minds and, you know, in the psyche of Australians to say that they're better on women, but they're absolute dog poo when it comes to their treatment of women. We might have, you know, an equal amount of women, but that certainly doesn't mean we've got an equal amount of power, particularly when the men who do hold the power were quite happy to just sit and watch this happen to me. So those bystanders and the betrayal of those bystanders is just, it equates to being similar to the initial injury itself.
I'm sorry that happened, Emma. I mean, it's just appalling, and I would like to, you know, really acknowledge you for sharing that. So thank you. And if this brings up anything for anyone else who's joining us, we do have a private room, and we are able to chat with you about what's gone on for you. So I want you to know this is a safe space. I might just, before we move on to Amani, ask, how did this impact your mental health? Because it was like operating in a parallel universe. You knew what was right and wrong, but this whole creation was taking place, which you couldn't stop. And you know, some people have often described it to me as like being forced into a corner and constantly hit over the head with a pole, you know, like with a metal pole.
I think Annabelle Crabb, I saw, so there are 2 aspects to that, Kathy. The first one was that this all happened and took place from the end of July until the beginning of August. And so it finished when Scott Morrison toppled Malcolm Turnbull for the leadership. So that's the only thing that broke the media cycle for me. Thanks, boys. At least you were good for something, Scott Morrison. It interrupted that media cycle. I had to continue to show up to Parliament until the April of the following year. And I described that as being divorced but living under the same roof. Every one of my colleagues treated me like I had leprosy. They avoided me. I didn't get invited to things. The housemate that I shared a house with, so I was renting a property in Canberra with Matt Keogh, who's an MP. He was elected at the same time as me. He called me. No, actually, I think he texted me and he said, I've got to move out. I can't stay living with you because of the optics of it. So even somebody that I'd shared a home with and that I trusted implicitly, you know, I'd minded his kids, he'd minded my kids, you know, I'd stayed in their family home over here in Perth. Somebody that I had a very deep friendship with was able to walk away. So there's the betrayal of that and having to stay in there for all of that time. And I would explain the mental health side of it as a 3-phase impact. So there was the initial crisis stage where I developed panic attacks, where I developed really quite deep paranoia. I still have those things quite considerably. I had suicidal ideation, so I didn't want to die. And sorry, I'm going to get emotional. I didn't want to die, but I just wanted it to stop. Just stop. Like, and I think Brittany also, you know, articulated this quite well. People were talking about me as though I wasn't a person anymore. I wasn't a living, breathing, tissue holding, organ living thing anymore. I was not a human. I was being dissected piece by piece by piece. And I stopped feeling like I was the person, the way they were talking about me in the media. And then we moved from that media stage and that initial crisis to, I guess, the after effects. So that went on for probably a good year. And that was just trying to just calm the life back down that I'd had and start to rebuild. And then I would say there's this phase that I'm in now. And I still have some of the effects. I've been diagnosed with, no Robinson Crusoe, but complex PTSD. I've been diagnosed with depressive mood disorder. So I can have really good periods and be very functional, and then I can go into really deep, I call them spasms or funks, where I can be very, very low. The ability to trust people and is just gone from me. I struggle with my memory. My short-term memory is just blown a fuse. I used to be able to play the piano, which is behind me. I struggle to be able to remember and play my music now, which I'm trying to get back, trying to do lots of brain exercises to try and recreate some synapses and some new neural pathways. And anxiety is probably a big feature of what I've been through. And then I think with all of that, we can acknowledge all of that. But I think that what we need to acknowledge at the same time is that, and I think that you'll figure out that eye contact has become a bit of a problem, because I can't actually, because I'm accessing parts of my brain where I have to remember and really do some deep thinking. Someone will ask me a question and then I'll forget what the question actually was. It's quite distracting. The ability to concentrate is gone. I can probably last about 20 minutes on a good day, 45 minutes on a great day, but then I'm incredibly tired after that. But I think what's important about all of that to recognize is that I've been in treatment pretty much since it happened. So I have a psychologist that I see every week, and she's trauma-based. She's actually a sexual trauma therapist, because what they describe happening to me is in that same, that betrayal, that loss of agency, the shame, the guilt, it all belongs in there. I meet with my psychiatrist every 6 weeks. And I've really relied on exercise, breathing techniques, and, doing things like basic stuff, like going to the beach, the sand between my toes, and digging around in the garden. So I think that whilst the symptoms and the symptomology can be quite huge, when you learn how to manage those things, like anything else that we have wrong with us. So if it was a diabetic condition, diabetics learn to manage their condition. Epileptics do the same. People who have cancer do exactly the same. And I think that all those are very accepted in our society. But when you tell people that I'm off to my therapist, or it's therapy Thursday, which is how I spend my Thursdays, people freak out. And I'm like, well, you wouldn't freak out if I told you how I was managing my insulin or that I was skin pricking myself. And everything has a strategy. And so if we just accept that, okay, this is exactly the same as any other health condition, and that's the treatment, and they're the strategies that I use when my insulin is going too low or too high. These are the strategies that I use when my anxiety or paranoia or lack of concentration or ability is too high or too low, or my regulation is not great. Then I think we should all just get on with it. And people need to not view that sort of mental health space. I think if we called mental health trauma, it would probably go down a little bit.
Absolutely, Emma. And I've got to say, we're all sending you a huge virtual hug at the moment. Thank you.
No, don't hug me. I'll cry. And I don't.
but I really, okay. The other thing I will say,
just like squeezes all the emotion and the tears, and then it all comes, and you're like, oh. So,
yeah. The other thing I will say, leading into Amani, you suffered an injury, and there is an interview at the beginning of today's session where the well-known journalist, New Yorker, Io Press, talks about Moralinjury and talks about bystanders, going back to a sociologist all the way back to 1938. And he says that it's not that they don't act, it's that it's all neat and tidy and they want somebody else to act, which I think is really telling about bystanders, because we often think, well, why don't they do something? Well, they know that it's not pleasant and they want somebody else to speak out. telling. So Amani, on that really deep note, you've got another, I guess, deep story, but you've used your voice in a really powerful way.
Thank you, Kathy. And Emma, I just want to express solidarity and say that a lot of what you said really resonated with me, even though my moral injuries come from a completely different set of circumstances. I think the misogyny and the unrealistic expectations and shame that's projected onto victims is a common thread. I've written a lot about my experiences, but I think it kind of helps to contextualize what I'm going to talk about. I lost my mum to domestic violence in 2015. She was murdered by my dad in her home in the process of separating from him. And I've done a lot of advocacy in the domestic violence space since the end of his trial. And I've had the opportunity as well to, I guess, work on my own healing process and access that professional support and remove a lot of the shame and stigma, at least for myself and for my family, that is associated with being in therapy or seeking support for trauma. And a big part of what I talk about is what that's looked like for me and the benefits that it's had. And I really do believe that we need to do more to support people who've experienced trauma, because sometimes the help that you need is going to be required for a longer period than what other people seem to think. Workplaces seem to assume that it's a thing that you can sort of pack up and leave at home and push aside in order to meet your regular obligations. So I guess the first type of moral injury that I want to speak to that really shaped my experience of victimhood in the wake of the murder was some of that systemic and social expectation and the barriers that go with that. So when you feel really hurt by something that you feel is a black and white moral, morally clear thing, like a murder, like the taking of a life from another individual, you can sometimes have an assumption that the impact of that violence and the effects of that violence should be obvious and clear to other people, and that empathy will automatically be extended to you when you share your story or when you seek help. And it's very confronting to begin seeking help in the first place, and then to realize that that empathy does not come automatically, and that there is a lack of awareness socially across all industries about the effects of trauma, about the effects of sexism, about the effects of being silenced. So I was incredibly disappointed to discover how little empathy and how little trauma-informed support there is available across all spaces. And that went to everything like, trying to access support through Centrelink, which I've written about the barriers that I faced in terms of accessing parental leave, trying to access healthcare when you don't yet have language to describe your PTSD. You're not calling it that yet. I didn't get a formal diagnosis. I didn't think that that's what I was experiencing until way down the track. Being in this vulnerable position where you're not quite able to describe your own limitations and your own symptoms, and not being ever asked a question about, what's going on for you, what's led you to this point, what's happening in your life that might be contributing to an ailment or a financial issue or anything like that. That for me was a huge disappointment, because I found myself constantly trying to explain. I couldn't always clearly link how I was feeling emotionally and psychologically to what I was expecting from whoever I was speaking to at the time, or what kind of help I was seeking. And it wasn't always a tangible connection. I wanted perhaps more time or more flexibility or some kind of understanding or empathy in response. And that was really hard to access. I think one of the things that we can improve is not having a one-size-fits-all response in all these different government agencies, banks and health systems and things like that. I think it's really important for people across these industries, anyone who encounters someone who might be traumatized needs to be trauma informed and needs to receive that training. And I found that was really lacking. On a more personal level, and then in terms of my family, one of the things that was really confronting and which I would describe as a moral injury was the disappointment and the sense of betrayal that came with the fact that my dad had destroyed our relationship, had not just murdered someone, taken my mum from me, injured my sister, disrupted every aspect of our lives. It was also the fact, and this goes back to bystanders, it was the fact that his family's automatic response was to try and save face and protect him and try and figure out what they were going to do in regards to his defense. And he very quickly was able to access a lawyer and receive solidarity from his loved ones, whereas the same people were people I'd grown up with and I'd looked up to as figures of authority in my life, or figures who represented safety or security, or who would be even able to stand in for my parents should I ever need it. And to discover that their loyalty lay elsewhere, and that the priority was really about his needs rather than mine or my sister's, was a huge disappointment. And it really made it even harder to move forward, because I could sort of see, okay, well, this individual, he's going to go through a court process. He's going to have some kind of process of accountability, despite all the different barriers that are associated with that, which I'll speak to in a minute. But these people are just doing things that are, you know, it's not illegal to want to support him. It's not illegal to not care about my feelings, but it's exhausting for me to try and convince you that you should be expressing solidarity, that I need your support, that I need you there for me, that I need to feel heard and validated. And instead of doing that, they went a step further and also began making allegations, for example, down the track when I provided my statement to the police, that I'd lied and exaggerated things, that my father was a good father and I was using this crime to make him look bad, which I just can't understand how.
I didn't think you needed any help. I think you did a great job.
He made himself look bad. Sure. And trying to use shaming and silencing tactics to prevent me from cooperating with the court process. And up until the date of my mum's death, I was a practicing commercial litigation solicitor. I'd been in courtrooms. I understood the procedure. I had literacy and awareness around these sorts of matters. I wasn't a criminal lawyer, but I understood rules of evidence. I understood the justice system. And to then have to sit in court and be subjected to a cross-examination in which my dad's barrister insinuated that I was lying or not remembering things clearly, or when he focused on things that I felt were not really central to my mum's experience and her story, to feel the pressure of having to highlight the nuance and complex things that shaped her life as a daughter, and to face my father for the first time in such a, you know, emotional and heated environment. It was so confronting and really compounded the trauma of the original crime. And the trial took place 2 years after the murder. So there were 2 years of uncertainty, 2 years of having a very stalled recovery process, because you don't know what's going to happen next. So therapy can only get you so far when you don't have any certainty or closure around the legal process. All of these things left me feeling quite disillusioned, not just with my family, not just with humanity, but with the legal system as well, where that was a space where I practiced and where I felt confident and where I'd been trained. And it totally shifted my relationship with this whole institution. And I think when you experience that rupture, it's very hard to imagine going, I don't think I've been back in a courtroom since then, since reading my victim impact statement. I don't like the idea of it, but I have, I guess, leaned into that a little bit in my advocacy in order to help highlight some of those barriers and some of the changes that we could be making to make it easier for others. So it was very confronting to be faced with these multiple consecutive disappointments, one after another, at a time where I was quite vulnerable. I was pregnant when my mum was murdered, and then had another baby the following year, I felt that there was a lot of gossip happening. And I think, Emma, you spoke to the effects of that gossip happening in my family, in my community. I did not know who to trust anymore. I felt really let down that people I'd grown up around had just gone completely silent. And I, like you said, you know, you can't help but read that as tacitly endorsing the behavior of the person who's hurt you, whether or not they mean that's their intentions in that situation are irrelevant. But the fact that you haven't said something to me, you haven't expressed solidarity to me, I will read that as hostility, and I will read that as you tacitly endorsing that behavior. And in my book, I mention Judith Herman's work and how she says that all the perpetrator asks is that the bystanders do nothing. That's all it takes to give the perpetrator what they're looking for. And I before I even had the words for that, before I was able to articulate any of this, I sensed that lack of safety in my body. I sensed self-doubt. I used to be a confident, I've been able to rebuild a lot of that, but I was a confident public speaker, for example. And I remember having to then present for a uni subject that I was doing and feeling completely exhausted and overwhelmed by the task at hand. I was shaky. My teacher noticed I was nervous. It took me a long time to rebuild my cognitive capacity, which Emma also spoke about, to be able to hold the amount of information that I was able to hold as a lawyer. I was so proud of that. You know, I was proud of what I could do. I was proud of how much work I could get done in a day. I was proud of how competent I was, and how much I enjoyed learning and reading and absorbing. And I couldn't do any of that for a period. And it took a long time to rebuild and to be able to start doing those things again and start doing them confidently. So I think what's been really valuable in this conversation is highlighting the link between those mental and emotional experiences and the physical and the practical and the way that your work, your employment can be affected by moral injury.
Thank you, Amani. So I'd just like to wrap for those people that are leaders in their businesses and have people reporting to them. Amani touched on training your front line, and you do need to, because there's never a right time when somebody just has a total trauma breakdown. And if you're on the end of the phone, you know, whether it's a call center or whatever it might be, you are responsible for making sure that person is okay. You are not responsible for just sending them a whole lot of numbers and say, here, call Lifeline, this is, because by default, you're just sending them, you know, you're reinforcing victimhood. You have the caring conversation, you listen, and you refer on. Now, if you're unable to refer on, you find out and you get back to them. You know, it's really interesting in our day-to-day work. We actually have a whole range of women who can't read standard letters, who get a letter from an insurer or a bank or something, and it's so re-traumatizing because of the issues at hand that we get sent the letters and ask, will we read them and tell them what's in the letter? That's how trauma plays out. So moral injury is about your leadership. It is about looking at the wider circle. So, you know, bystanders, everybody, it's not just about your narrow focus. And we all have a responsibility as human beings to care for each other. So thank you, Amani, and thank you, Emma.
Thanks very much for having me.
Thank you for having me, Kathy.